Now, there is a moment, if there were people who were watching the game live, where for maybe like 30 seconds to a minute, I think in this position before moving, I had this strange facial expression where my face changed to like, I had an aha moment. And the reason I had that was because somewhere around here, I had this strange suspicion, I think, that after rook a1, that there was maybe this move knight to f5. And welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be going over the 4th round game that I played here in the FIDE Grand Prix in Berlin. Now, as you guys know, the tournament has not gone very well for me. I lost the first game to Aronian with the black pieces. I got banned from Twitch that evening. I struggled through the last 2 games, making draws against Andrei Yesipenko and Grigory Oparin. And of course, today in the 4th round, I had the white pieces against Aronian. Again, so once again, what I would add you guys is that obviously a very important moment for me. I really want to try to put pressure on Levon. If I did not find a way to convert and win today's game, pretty much my chances of qualifying for the candidates tournament were over. So without further ado, let's jump right into the game. So it starts out with e4, e5. Now here I go knight f3, knight to c6, and I play bishop to b5. Now, in our previous match in Berlin in the first leg, Levon played a6, bishop a4, knight f6 castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, and castles. The idea behind this for Levon was obviously he was trying to play the Marshall Gambit with pawn to d5. So this time around, Levon chooses to mix it up by playing the Berlin. Now, one great thing is that since I had played Levon before, I was sort of prepared for this possibility 3 weeks ago, which means I just had to review my notes for what I was going to do against it today. So here I played d3, bishop to c5, c3, and now Levon plays d5. Now, when I did preparation for Levon 3 weeks ago, I did look at this variation. I thought it was one of the possibilities. However, Levon did play this yesterday against Andrei Yesipenko. So therefore, I wasn't really sure whether he would repeat it or not. Usually Levon tries to move around rather than repeating the same variation. So I was definitely a little bit surprised to see this, but I was also happy at the same time because it meant that I would get something that I had prepared. So I trade the pawns on d5, and now I go bishop c4. Levon plays queen to d6. I go knight bd2, and Levon castles b4, attacking the bishop on c5, bishop b6, and now I castle out of the center, and here Levon plays bishop f5. Now already we've deviated just a little bit from his game against Andrei, but as I said before, I did prepare this several weeks ago, so I was very happy to see all these moves. So here I go queen c2, rook a d8 is played, and now I play the move pawn to a4 here. Now the idea behind a4 is actually quite simple. If black tries to grab this extra pawn in the center of the board here, we trade everything off, and now I go pawn to a5, and this bishop on b6 is completely trapped. There are no good squares for it to go to, and I will end up ahead by a bishop. So therefore, black cannot capture this pawn on d3, and instead Levon plays a5. It's worth noting that a6 is also a possible move here, but a5 is the most principled continuation. So I play pawn to b5, knight to e7 is played, and now I play the very sneaky move queen to a2. So here I play queen a2, and the idea is quite simple. If black tries to take the pawn on d3 here, I have this very tricky move, bishop to a3. Now, if black moves the queen away to, let's say, d7, I trade the bishops on d3, and then I win the knight on e7, and with it, I win the game as well. So therefore, black has to be very careful here. Now, it's worth noting that after bishop a3, bishop c5, bishop d3, black can still take the bishop on a3, but after bishop c2, bishop to c5 back, knight c4, forking the queen and the pawns here, queen to e6, knight takes a5. White still retains a little bit of an advantage due to the weaknesses on e5 and b7, and the game will go on. So instead, Levon plays knight g6, develops a knight to g6. Maybe it can go to f4 to attack d3 or g2. Also, it supports the pawn on e5 as well. So a very logical move. So here I play bishop a3, bishop to c5. Now, black does not go pawn to c5 here, because then we have the glitch rule where I can play en passant, pawn takes pawn, and after queen takes pawn, I just take the rook on f8, and I'm winning once again. So therefore, black plays bishop c5, we trade, and now I play d4. Levon goes queen d6, rook fe1. Now, this is all still my preparation from several weeks ago, so up to this point, I was feeling pretty good. So now Levon trades and goes knight d5. Now, this was the first original move for me. I had looked at many different continuations. I'd looked at knight f4, c6, I think h6 also. So many different possibilities, but Levon plays knight d5, which is one of the moves that I had not looked at. Now, it's worth noting that, as I've mentioned several times already, in my preparations before the game, after h6 g3 knight to d5 here, if this is played, sorry about that sound by the way, after knight to d5 we can trade on d5, and if I go knight c4 in this position, black has this very tricky move bishop to g4 attacking the knight on f3, and now it's different because my pawn is not on g2. So when I was thinking during the game what to do after knight d5 was played here, I was thinking, well, he hasn't played h6 g3, and also if I try to play something like queen b3, I was a little bit skeptical that there might be a knight b4 idea, creating this fork threat on c2, and after say rook c1 there might be a knight hop with knight f4, and it felt like there was a lot of pressure potentially, so I didn't really like this. So therefore in this position I thought, well, okay, I'm not sure what's going on, but I know that if I trade everything on d5 here and go knight c4, at the very least the game will be a draw, but I'm going to be winning a pawn, because if black tries to guard with either b6 or rook to a8 here, I have knight e3 forking the rook and the bishop, and I will be winning some material. So Levon plays bishop g4, which is what I expected. I take, he goes b6, knight c6, and we trade off. Now, as I said before, when I was thinking for about, I want to say 15 minutes on this capture on d5, I did envision this endgame, and as I said before, I felt that white's up a pawn here, even if the pawns are double on f2, f3, white's up a pawn here, so white can't really be in any danger. And additionally, long term, if I can go rook c1 or rook c4, maybe I can try to put pressure on Levon, maybe even win the game perhaps. So I was very happy to see this. Now, it's worth noting that in this position, both orders are playable here. Bishop takes f3 is probably preferable, and here black should actually go c6. So now if I take on b7, after pawn takes pawn a5, black can play rook takes d4, a6, and now after rook a8, I believe the position should be a draw. Levon, after the game in the post-game interview, he alluded to this variation. I strongly suspect that in the past when he had analyzed this variation, this is what he had looked at. But again, he hadn't looked at this for a while, wasn't expecting it, and it's very hard to remember all your preparation. When you think about the number of variations you're looking at, they go many, many moves deep. Already this position has moved 27, so it's very impractical to try to review all the time. And in this case, Levon simply couldn't remember, and therefore he didn't do this. If he had done this, he probably would have been able to draw the game. So instead he played b6, which objectively is a fairly serious error, because even though it looks like the structure is very stable here and I have these weaknesses, long term I can go for knight e7, rook c1. There's a lot of pressure on the c file and on the e file as well, and I feel that white should be a little bit better here, although again, if a computer is playing this with a black piece, I suspect it would draw this pretty easily. So here Levon plays h6, and this is really the start of Levon going for plans which don't really make a lot of sense. What I felt he should have done was played rook a8, and if I go a move like rook c1, for example, I thought after king f8, rook to c4, that black would play a move like rook d7 and knight e7 potentially, or even a move like knight h4, and I thought black had ample compensation for the extra pawn that I have here, these crummy double pawns on f3 and f2. Fortunately for me, Levon plays h6, and now I go rook c1. Now it's worth noting again, I have to think about this endgame from the standpoint of what positions do I have winning chances in. Now the computer on first glance says knight e7 is a good move, but after we trade the knights and he takes d4, I take c7, and rook a8 is played. This does lead to an endgame which is drawn, even though I'm an extra pawn. So we trade the rooks, I take on b6, and after a move like rook a1, king g2, g5, actually not g5, sorry, that hangs a pawn. Let's say rook b1 first, rook b8, king h7, b6, and g5 here. King g3, rook b4. This should be a draw with perfect play. Very hard to make use of the extra pawn here because the rook is in front of the pawn, and also with the pawn structure so compromised on the king side, I don't really have an entry to get my king into the game. If I go king g2, black can just go rook b1 to stop the king walk, and again if I go f4, he can even just take and drop back to b4. So again, at this point I had to think about what are the endgames where I have winning chances versus an endgame where maybe I have an extra pawn but it will be a forced draw. So I play rook c1 here. Logical move, by the way, just to maybe play knight b4, maybe play knight e7, try to play on the c file here. So Levon plays king h7, and now I play rook to c4. Logical move here, I guard a4, I guard d4, and now maybe I can look to move the knight to b4, e5, or e7. So here Levon plays rook g5, king f1, and now he goes rook h5. And this is where I really felt that Levon started to become a little bit careless, did not really sense the danger that was lurking in the position, because now I have this very nice move, knight to e7. Now after the game, Levon said that he missed this move. I think that Levon only saw knight e5, but after knight f4, if I go, let's just say king g1 for example, if black plays knight d5 here, you'll notice that the knight guards the pawns, and the knight can't be removed here because I can't access the c5 square. So even if I put the rook here, black goes here, there's still no way to remove this great knight on d5 that's guarding everything. So here I played knight e7, and I think this is really where Levant started to get really concerned about his position, because initially I suspect he wanted to go knight f4, but after knight f4 I have the very nice move pawn to d5 here, and now the knight's under attack. And if black trades on d5, one thing you'll notice that's different here is that in this position, after rook a8, let's just say rook e4, the pawn is still guarded on a4, so we're not getting an automatic trade of the pawns on a4. And if black plays a move like rook d1, king g2, rook a1, trying to grab the pawn, now I can go rook takes f7, rook takes a4, rook e7, double stacking on the 7th rank, rook to g8, and now rook b7. And you'll notice here I'm going to end up with 4 pawns versus 2, and this should be winning for white because I have 2 extra pawns versus 1 extra pawn. So instead, Levant plays rook takes h2, and now I play the great move rook to e4. Initially, I did want to play king g1, but after king to g1 here, black is a very important move, rook h4, not rook h5, by the way, because after rook h5, now if we trade, I take on c7, rook f3, rook to e to e7. This is very, very good for white, if not, in fact, winning. So initially I wanted to play king g1, but once I spotted this idea of rook h4 putting pressure on the 4th rank, I opted against it, because now if I take and I take on c7, after rook d4, rook to e7 here, black has a couple of options. Probably the safest one is to just go rook g8, and after rook to a7 here, black can play a move like rook f4, king g2, and then a move like g5 here. And again, black should be able to draw this game without too much difficulty. So instead I play rook e4, logical move because I developed the rook, I stop rook h4, but also maybe I'm going to play a move like d5. And to illustrate the point, let's say black plays a move like rook a8 here. If I trade and go d5, now you'll notice that both rooks are guarding the pawn in a4. So both of these rooks are absolutely perfectly placed. So rook e4 is a very deep conceptual move, but the idea behind it is that I can play d5, try to create this passed pawn, but also laterally guard the knight and guard the pawn, knight on e7 and the pawn on a4. So here Levant plays rook h1, king g2, and rook a1. Now there is a moment, if there were people who were watching the game live, where for maybe like 30 seconds to a minute, I think in this position before moving, I had this strange facial expression where my face changed to like I had an aha moment. And the reason I had that was because somewhere around here I had this strange suspicion, I think, that after rook a1 that there was maybe this move knight to f5. Now the reason I had the aha sort of expression on my face was because I realized that what the knight on f5 does is it really dominates the knight on g6. Now this knight would love to move, but you'll notice that there are no squares for the knight to go to. All these squares here are covered by the rook, the knight, and the pawn. And I had this aha moment, and this would have been a great choice. Now the reason that I did not play this move is because in this position, initially I thought rook takes c7 was the best move, but after knight e7, rook takes e7, rook a4, d5 here, black can simply go rook a5 here, and after I go d6, this is different than the game, so after rook b5, d7, rook d8, if I play rook takes f7 here, after black plays a move like rook to g5, king f1, and then I think king g6 is a move, rook e7, black can again play this move rook to e5, and he should be able to draw the game, but it's very, very complex and not easy to find. Nonetheless, I strongly felt that this is drawn. So when I was thinking for a long period of time here, the two moves that I thought were rook c7 and knight g6. And the problem is that I had thought about knight f5 in this earlier position when I played rook e4, but it eluded my thought process in this position. So the only two moves I saw were rook c7 or knight g6. So once I calculated this line with rook e7, rook takes e7, rook a4 is not winning, then I thought, okay, well, if this is no good, then I have to go for the other one with knight takes knight. Now this is a very severe blunder. As I said, if I play knight f5 here and black goes rook d8, after rook takes c7, king g8 here, white can play a move like knight to e7, and you keep a lot of pressure here after knight takes, rook takes, a lot of pressure. I don't know if this is winning for sure, but it's going to be very difficult for black to defend. However, during the game, when I played knight takes g6, pawn takes, I thought that after rook c7, I was just winning because I calculated rook a4 and d5. But when Levant was thinking here, it did occur to me that black has this other move, rook to f5. And if Levant had found rook f5 here, the game would have ended in a draw. And the reason for that is because now if I go rook e to e7 here, black can check, king h2 is played here, and now black has the very nasty move rook to a2, and after rook g7, king h8, black is simply going to gobble all these pawns on the f2 and f3, and my king does not have a way back into the center of the game, and this would be a draw. Fortunately for me, after taking, Levant thought for, I want to say, only a couple of minutes despite having a lot of time here, and he took on a4. Now this is a huge mistake because now after I go d5, black is in serious trouble since I have this passed pawn that's marching up the board. Now, if black were to trade on e4, this would be suicide because now I end up with 3 connected pawns that are just rolling right down the center of the board. So black can't take. More importantly, unlike the other variation after rook to a5 here, for example, it's much different than the other variation because a pawn can march to d6 here. So in the previous variation that we were looking at, right back here with rook c7 takes, rook takes e7, rook a4, d5, rook a5, d6. After takes d7, rook d8, you'll notice that I have to take on f7. I cannot play for rook e8 right away. Whereas in the game, when we reach this position here, after rook a5, d6, after rook b5, d7, this is simply game over. Because if black goes rook d5 here, I have a very nice move, rook to c8, offering the exchange of rooks. If black goes rook to g8, for example, I can just trade the rooks, go rook e8 check, and then make a new queen and win the game. So the reason that rook a5 doesn't work here is because both of my rooks have access to c8 and e8 because the pawn on d7 supports both of them. So it's very different than the other variation without knight takes g6. So in this position, rook a8 is played by Levon, and now I go rook to e7, stacking the rooks, and now Levon plays h5. Rook g8 was a move here, but again, after pawn to d6, this is probably close to loss because of the fact that if black plays a move like g5 here, I go d7, rook a d8, and now I can very simply go, I think rook c6 or rook e6 both work, but let's just say rook e6 here, and after rook to b8 is played, for example, I can now go rook ec6, again threatening to go rook c8. If black goes rook d8, I just take, come back and push the pawn. And if black goes rook g to d8 here, I can simply go rook to c8, offering the trade of the rooks again. And now when black plays a move like h5, I take this rook and I go rook c8 and I win once again. So here Levon plays h5, sort of a desperado, trying to activate his king. So here I play d6. Now during the game I wasn't really sure whether I should take or play d6, but I thought it's a pass pawn. As they say in the Russian school of chess, you push your pass pawn if you can. So I go d6, rook f5 is played, and now I take, king h6, I check, and I go pawn to d7 here, threatening to go rook c8 here and win the game. So Levon plays rook d5, very tricky move here, and now I find the brilliant move f4. The problem here is that if I go rook c8, black can actually play rook takes d7, and now if I take the rook on a8, he takes the rook on h7, and if I take the rook on d7, he takes the rook on c8. So that's why here I play this tricky move f4. And the reason this is such a tricky move is because if black takes the pawn, now rook c8 in fact does win, because if the rook moves, so let's just say a2, I make a queen, and I'm ahead by 1 rook. And now when black plays rook takes d7, I go rook c4 check, in between move, and when the king moves, I just take the rook on d7, and I win the game. So I played f4, sort of very tricky move, activate the pawn, and here Levon goes king h4. Now, this move does sort of simplify the task a little bit for me. I thought that king f5 was maybe a better try, but still after rook c6, rook to d8, I can go rook f7 check, king e4, rook to e6 check, important check, because if I take, after we swap, he can take the pawn on f4. So I throw in the check first, king has to go this way, and now I eat the pawn here, we trade, and after rook takes g6, this should be a pretty routine win. Again, the king is on d4 versus e4, so I have the wide pipos, and the pawns are simply too much for black to defend against. So I thought king f5 was maybe a better try, although he still would have been very difficult to play and probably lost objectively. But after king h4, now I play the move rook to g7 here, and the problem is black's king kind of gets stuck on the rib. Now, one thing that's important to note about this move, however, is that Levon is trying to be very tricky and set up some stalemate possibilities. So one cool line, just to show you guys, is let's say black plays rook d8 here. The correct way to win, by the way, would be just to go king f3, king e4, march the king up the board, and eventually play rook c8. But if I were to play a move like rook takes g6, for example, let's say black trades, and I play this move f5. Of course, I would never play this in a game, but let's just say for argument's sake I do. After rook f7, let's say I play f6 to guard the pawn, there's a very sneaky rook to g7 here. And if I capture the rook with the pawn, it's stalemate. King has no squares, rook takes, stalemate, same thing. So the only way to try to play on is to go rook g3, but now after rook f7, rook g6, rook g7, the game would end in a draw. So that's the one thing I had to be careful of with Levon putting his king here, is trying to set up these stalemate possibilities. So Levon plays rook a4 here, and now I go rook to c8. The idea, of course, trying to promote the pawn. Levon goes rook d4, and now I take on g6. Has to take this one. If he takes f4, I can actually just make the queen, because after rook takes, there's no stalemate. If rook g4, I trade, and if rook f2, I can take, because the king now has a free square on h3. So Levon plays rook d7. I go rook to c1 here, trying to create the ladder checkmate. Rook d1, we trade, and now I take on b6, and Levon goes king g4. Now, at this point, I was pretty confident that this endgame is winning, but I did feel like here perhaps I should have just gone king f3 first to make the task a little bit easier, because as soon as I took on b6, I realized that after king g4 there was going to be a defensive setup that would be kind of difficult to break. So I play rook b8, king f4, b6, and now black goes rook d7. Now if black were to say go king f5, just to illustrate the point, in king g6, this is actually losing by force, because I can, well, let me put the king here, and I go b7. And after rook b1, the rook cannot move from b8 because I'm black captures on b7. But now I can go f4. Let's just say rook b3, f5, h4. Actually, let's say rook b6, f5, h4, f6 check. If black takes with the king, I go rook f8 check, make the queen and win the game. If black takes with the rook, I just go rook c8, make a queen next move, and I win the game. And if black goes king f7, now I can go rook to h8, threatening to promote the pawn. And after rook takes, I go rook h7 check, collecting the rook on b7. And so black has simply lost to king h7. I just go f7, f8 as well. So I did realize that in this endgame that I would be winning by force if I could get that setup. However, there's a very tricky move here, rook to d7. Now, fortunately for me, there are multiple ways to win, and I found the easiest one. Initially, I was going to play b7, but this is very, very tricky because after rook f7, there's a zugzwang that wins the game here. I have to go king h2. Actually, no, sorry, I have to go king h3, king to g5, or sorry, king h3, wait, is it king h3 or is it king h2? Actually, I think it's king h3, and if black plays king f5, then I can go king g3. And now if black plays a move like, let's just say king f6, I can go king f4. It's kind of a zugzwang situation. Black has to move the king or the rook, and my king is running very fast to c6 to guard the pawn. So this is winning. And if black tries to move like rook g7 here, I go king f3, rook f7, stopping the check. And now I can go king e3, h4 here, and now I go king f3 back, and this is winning by force. Again, I won't get into all the intricacies or the fine details about this, but I did see this idea during the game, but I figured if there's something easier to play, why go for this? It's also worth noting, by the way, if I go running here for the pawn on h5, this is actually a forced draw because black can go king f5, king h4, king f4, and whichever way I go, he always threatens a checkmate. And if I go to h6, f6, again after f3, king f5, this is still a draw because after f4, king f6, f5, king takes f5, and it's a draw. And if I go rook a8 just to show one more cool endgame, actually, sorry, let's say I play f4 just to show one more cool endgame. After takes rook f8 here, this is actually a draw because black goes king g4, f5, rook b6 check, f6, king to f5, king g7. And you'd think that white's probably winning. You're going to push f7, move the rook away, and win the game. But black can go king g5 here, and you're actually stuck. And this position is a draw because if I play f7, black just starts checking, and I can never escape. So I can't push the pawn. If I move the rook away, black just takes, and on rook a5, black blocks. And if I play rook f7, black just chills on the 6th rank forever and keeps an eye on the pawn at f6. So this would be a draw. Now, of course, I did see a lot of these ideas, but I was getting a little bit low on time. We've been playing for about 5.5 hours at this point. So I figured no need to really be creative here and look for the difficult win or the study-like win. Just find the easiest, simple one. So I play rook f8 check here. And now Levon goes king e4. If king e5 is played here, I can just go rook h8 and win the pawn on h5 and win the game. So he goes king e4, and now the very important move, rook to f3. And one of the maxims about rook and pawn endgames is if you have a passed pawn and you can get your rook behind the pawn, generally it's winning. So rook f3 is a very important concept here. Also, it's worth noting also in rook and pawn endgames, generally if black has the rook behind the pawn, there are very good drawing chances. So if you have the passed pawn, you can get the rook behind the pawn. Generally, you have great winning chances, and vice versa. If your opponent who has less material or less pawns can get their rook behind the passed pawn, they have very good drawing chances. So I play rook f3 here, and in this position, Levon, I believe, chose to resign in view of the fact that he cannot go king d5 here because I go check, I trade, and now I can just go f4, and it's the classic wide peepos. I go f5, king is not in time to stop both of the pawns. King b6, f6, king c6, f7, king d7, and I make a queen, and I win the game. So black can't go king d5, so the only other move is rook b7, but now I go rook b3. Actually, if rook g7, by the way, I do just block, and then I go rook b3 next move, so rook b7, rook to b3, and now after king d5, I can just march with my king up, king h3, king c4, rook b1, king c5, king h4, and this is just a very simple win. The rook can never move because then the pawn becomes a queen. And black can never trade the pawn either because then I'll trade. So I'm going to end up winning this h pawn, and the king and the f pawn will also just march down the board as well. So that's why in this position, after rook to f3, Levon resigned, and I'm back in the hunt. So overall, very pleasant game. I thought I played pretty well throughout. I'm still a little bit annoyed that I didn't play this knight f5 move in the late middle game because I did see the concept a couple of moves earlier when I was using a lot of time. So it's a little bit annoying that I didn't see that, but Levon missed his chances to draw with rook f5. And so I get the victory, and I am tied for second place now. The other game in our group between Grigorio Parin and Andrei Yesipenko was won by Grigori, so he does have a half-point lead over Levon and myself. But I do play him after the rest day with the white pieces in round 5, and I'm going to give it my best shot, and we'll see how it goes. Once again, I am unbanned on Twitch, so of course I feel a little bit more inspired perhaps at this point, but I will continue to do my recaps on YouTube for all of you guys who are watching, and stay tuned for more recaps of round 5 and round 6 here in Berlin. And until next time, thank you so much for all the love and support. See you guys soon.
Hikaru, you decided to repeat the opening from the yesterday's game. How long you were preparing?
Well, okay. I mean, I thought Levon might play this when we were here, what, 3 weeks ago? So, yeah, I mean, I had looked at something similar to this, but in a different position. I mean, with h6, g3, and then knight d5. And I mean, over the board, it just, I wasn't really sure if I should go into this endgame, but I thought, I mean, I should be a little bit better, and there's no risk, so that's why I did it. And I mean, I think Levon got careless, and he thought that there was no risk at all when he went for this whole, like, knight g6, or actually knight on g6, sorry, when he went for this whole rook g5, rook h5, all this stuff over there. And I mean, after I found this knight e7 move, I think it's very difficult practically. I suspect it's still a draw with correct play, but this is probably the critical moment.
Your comments?
Yeah, I think I've looked at this, but I didn't really remember the exact way to play there. So, but now I'm thinking, well, probably b6 was a positional mistake. Probably I should opt for c6. Bishop f3 takes in c6. Maybe that's what I have analyzed. I just couldn't fully remember, because knight b7, c take b, a5. And I think if I take on d4, and this knight on b7 is really disrupting white's harmony, because then you can play rook a8, and then it's not easy for white to progress. So I think this was a bad move, because my counterplay is not really there.
You agree that after 97 this was kind of difficult for you?
After which move?
Hikaru said that 97 he thought that this position was good for him.
Yeah, I've blundered 97 from distance. For some reason I thought I can always take this pawn, but then yeah, the d5 d6 comes too fast. So it was a bad game from me.
Okay. Any other comments today? No. What do you think about the situation? I mean, now still the other game is on the way. Have you checked it?
Yeah, I mean, but it's funny. It's probably very bad for both of us, I think, because I think Grigori will probably win this game. So, I mean, whatever, 2 more games, and we'll see what happens. So.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Hikaru, congratulations on the unban first. I think this is more important for you than winning the game today versus Levon. Did you sleep better last night?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's back to normal routines, I guess you could say. Yeah, I think obviously knowing there would be a broadcast, knowing that I was playing Levon, I mean, the most important game of at least this part of the event. Yeah, everything kind of worked out. So felt pretty good, felt positive, and I thought I played a pretty good game as well. So I'm very happy.
Sorry for the inconvenience. Would you please be so kind to explain to some of our viewers who still do not know what was the exact reason behind the ban?
Well, that's just because I was watching someone who's not allowed to. You're not allowed to show them on Twitch, plain and simple. Certain people you're not allowed to show, and that's that. But you know, at the end of the day, I will say that it was reduced by 1 day at least. So that definitely helped me last night in terms of just being able to shut off all the noise and focus on playing a good game of chess today. So it was kind of nice of Twitch to do that.
There is this opinion that you showing your games, your recaps of the games, could also be in a way bad for your chess, because your opponents would know some of your strategies, openings, maybe you share some secrets. Do you think it's just, let's say, overthinking them, or you just simply care more about the quality of the content than your opponents knowing your secrets?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, I'm pretty careful with what I say if I do recaps. I don't really go into long lines. Like this first game against Levon, for example, I did not say almost anything at all about what I did wrong other than the obvious moves. So, I mean, I don't think it's an issue as long as sort of it's on my mind and I'm thinking about that. I mean, that is one of the big differences, obviously, between myself and a lot of the other chess content creators because they don't have to worry about this. I mean, if you look at someone like Levy Rosman, he can go analyze his games. Doesn't matter. Nobody's going to watch his recaps. Whereas I do one sort of one recap and everybody's second or trainer obviously is just going to like watch the 10, 15-minute video and try to find something in there that they can use against me. So it's obviously not easy, but I think again I've figured out how to do the balance of like making it interesting and not sort of giving away too much, and seems to be working, so I'm pretty happy.
And perhaps one more question. How many times in your career did you have those cases that you went all in and it worked?
Well, I mean, I don't think this game is so much all in. I just tried to, you know, I played Levon 3 weeks ago. So again, I had already looked at a lot of different possibilities of what he could play. And so I had some stuff already saved up from that event. You know, I think I was just happy that I got something that I was expecting him to play last time. And that made life pretty easy. And of course, it also was pretty nice that we got to this end game where there was no risk. I could never lose, and if anything, I'm maybe a little bit better. So it's just very easy to play, and it was a pretty smooth game. So yeah, once again, obviously it's nice to win. But if you're asking like in sort of must win, I mean like the only time I can think of like World Cup type stuff. You mean? I mean, I don't think I've ever won. I mean, I couldn't beat Alyanov. I mean, I didn't beat Adams. I mean. Yeah, over the years, I can't recall actually in like a knockout winning the second game on all-in. But I will say there are events like the U.S. Championship in 2019 where I seem to win every game with black in what felt like must-win towards the end of that event. So sometimes it's worked, but in like a specific match format, I mean, almost never. So yeah, that's what it is.
Right, well, anyway, wishing you a great rest day for tomorrow and hopefully see you soon again.
Yeah, thank you.